Althea Mackenzie. Welcome to this synopsis of the first in our Cadmium Talks webinar series held on September 26. The Inter-American Institute for Cooperation on Agriculture, ICA, and the International Cocoa Organization, ICCO, launched the project Improving Capacity Building and Knowledge Sharing to support the management of cadmium levels in cocoa in Latin America and the Caribbean for export to the European region. The project aims to support cocoa-producing countries in Latin America and the Caribbean meet the 2019 European regulation and others to follow that set maximum levels for cadmium in cocoa and chocolate products. But just how much do we know about cadmium and what these regulations mean for our cocoa farmers and others along the cocoa value chain? Well, to provide the background to the project, here is Dr. Elizabeth Johnson, ICA representative in Jamaica for the Inter-American Institute for Cooperation on Agriculture.
Just to give you a little bit more information on this project called Improving Capacity Building and Knowledge Sharing to support management of cadmium levels in cocoa in Latin America and the Caribbean. Of course, this is a very long name, so, we have to shorten it, right? So we call it the Cadmium in Cocoa Project. So the Cadmium in Cocoa Project, this is being executed by ICA in 4 countries across Latin America and the Caribbean. They are Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Trinidad and Tobago. The project is supported through grant funding from the EU and the STDF, and it's being conducted by the Centers of Excellence for Research on Cadmium in Cocoa in Latin America and the Caribbean. The project consists of 3 components. Component 1 seeks to improve the ability of labs in Latin America and the Caribbean to do tests for cadmium in soil, as well as different types of cocoa tissues, such as leaves and beans, through a process of standardizing testing protocols and training lab technicians in these standardized protocols. The project will publish these standardized protocols so that any lab in the region will be able to follow these protocols to offer improved cadmium testing services. Component 2 is about a deeper research into cocoa growing areas where cadmium concentration is high in the soil, also called a hotspot. And we will learn more about these a little later on, but for now the research being done will try to determine some of the main reasons behind the elevated levels of cadmium and if there's anything we can do about it. So this brings me to the 3rd component of the project, which is outreach and updating of national cocoa sector plans. Now, based on the findings from the research component, science-based recommendations will be made to help farmers reduce the levels of cadmium in their beans so that they can sell their beans and cocoa products to local and international markets. Extension officers across Latin America and the Caribbean will be equipped and trained in teaching these science-based recommendations to our cocoa farmers. Now, under this component of the project also seeks to work with the national authorities in the 4 project countries to make the standardized testing protocols and the science-based recommendations to lower cadmium levels in the beans a part of their national plans for the further development of their cocoa sectors. So in this way, these practices will become the norm over time, and so we will achieve our overall goal of reducing cadmium in cocoa.
Thanks, Dr. Johnson. So cadmium in our foods is of great concern, but perhaps some of us are hearing about it for the first time. Let us now listen to Leslie Hoo Fung, who was the first presenter in the series, as she shared some information on cadmium in food and the regulation to protect human health. Leslie Hoo Fung is a research scientist at the International Center for Environmental and Nuclear Sciences at the University of the West Indies, and she explains exactly what cadmium is, how it gets into the food chain, and some of the effects it can have on our health.
So first of all, what is cadmium? Cadmium is a naturally occurring element. It's a metal in its pure form, but it also exists as multiple different compounds, again, naturally occurring in the environment. So it's in your soil, in your water, and so on. There are a number of negative health effects that can occur from cadmium exposure. It can cause cancer, meaning it's carcinogenic. It's nephrotoxic, meaning it can affect the kidneys, and it can also affect fetal development. There are a number of industrial uses of cadmium, including in rechargeable batteries, although efforts are being made to phase that out. They're used in solar panels, as well as dyes and pigments. Many years ago, a colleague of mine bought a car, a European car, and the car manual said this is a cadmium-free car, because previously cadmium pigments had been used in paints, automotive paints. Some of the man-made or anthropogenic sources include sewage sludge, mining waste, electronic waste, and fertilizers, particularly phosphate fertilizers that have been mined from phosphate rocks that might contain cadmium. How are you exposed to cadmium? Two of the main exposure pathways, unless you are someone who is working in a factory that is making cadmium products, is through smoking or through diet. Tobacco does accumulate cadmium from the soil, so does marijuana. So you could be exposed through the smoke, and through your diet, cadmium is in the soil, so it does, plants do take it up, and so it can end up in the food chain. But skin exposure is not considered a significant risk. So for example, if you're rubbing cocoa butter or something like that on your skin, you wouldn't expect to be exposed to cadmium that way. So because cadmium is present naturally in the environment and can end up in the food chain, it's monitored and or regulated in a number of food types, including root vegetables, leafy vegetables, rice, some types of seafood, especially shellfish, and of course, in cocoa and chocolate. There are a number of regulations governing cadmium levels in cocoa and chocolate. Internationally, there are the European Union regulations from 2014 regarding maximum levels of cadmium in foodstuffs, which does include cocoa and chocolate products. And the Codex Alimentarius, CXS 193, that is the general standard for contaminants and toxins in food and feed. The Codex Alimentarius is jointly run by the World Health Organization and the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN. The Codex is a collection of internationally adopted food standards which aim to protect consumer health and ensure fair practice in food trade. So first we look at the regulations from the European Union, which, as Dr. Johnson mentioned earlier, these came into effect in 2019. This is actually a lowering of the previous cadmium maximum limits for cocoa and chocolate. And so you'll see there, they have regulations for everything from milk chocolate with less than 30% cocoa, which the limit is 0.1, to chocolate with greater than 50% cocoa solids, which would be your dark chocolate, Althea's favorite, which is 0.8 milligrams per kilogram in the chocolate. They also have a regulation for cocoa powder, that's your drinking chocolate, whether sweetened or unsweetened, and that would be 0.6 milligrams per kilogram. This is also, if you've heard it called ppm, the ppm is the same thing as milligrams per kilogram. So these are the regulations for Codex Alimentarius. You'll see that they're not as many. They do not have a maximum limit for milk chocolate or for drinking chocolate. So they are primarily concerned with the dark chocolate. So you might wonder why there is a difference between the two standards. The maximum limit set by the European Union are actually stricter than the ones set out by Codex. And a big part of this is because while Europe represents only 6% of the world's population, they consume half the world's chocolate. So there was a proposal brought to Codex a few years ago to establish additional maximum limits for other categories of cocoa products as seen in the EU standards, but those were not approved.
Now, having heard about the reason for the project from Dr. Johnson, and with the information on how it gets into the food chain supplied by Leslie, it was then time to bring in researcher Daniel Guarin to provide information on cadmium in soils with specific reference to studies done in Colombia and Peru. Daniel Guarin is a researcher and PhD candidate at the Pennsylvania State University.
To begin with, let's start with how does exactly cadmium enters the soil profile. So it can be from either human activities, and it can happen through oil byproducts and acid drainage. It could happen through acid mine drainage, so mining activities. It could happen through agrochemicals, and it could happen through textile dyeing and tanneries. So if you are in an area where these four activities are very prevalent and you see a lot of them, there is a chance that you could have high levels of cadmium. I'm going to explain how that happens. So imagine this is your farm, right? You have your tree here, you have the soil profile, and you have a couple of streams coming into your farm, and those streams are coming from some mountains. The first thing that could happen is you have some oil exploitation here up in the mountain. All the wash away, all the acid mine, the acid drainage from that oil activity is being washed down by the river. And as it follows the river, it ends up in your soil via irrigation. Or if you are in a soil that floods every now and then, this water could be taking all the cadmium that's coming from oil upstream and depositing in your soil profile. Same thing with agrochemicals. If you have some farms upstream that are washing their crops with phosphate fertilizer, or they're using pesticides that are high in cadmium, all this runoff from the farm is going to end up in the stream, and then the stream is going to end up releasing that cadmium to your soil, so you have a second source there. The third one could be mine. If there's a big mining activity up in the mountains where the river is coming from, you could have all that acid mine drainage washing down the river and being deposited in your soil again. And finally, you might have some tanneries, you might have some textile dyeing activities going up the stream here. So if you have that, it could happen that all of the products are being washed away, and those products could be high in cadmium, and they could be being deposited into your soil when you're irrigating or when the soil floods. And this not only happens by water, this could happen by dust too. All of these activities result in dust, and all the dust particles fly up in the air. And for some reason, you're unlucky enough to have all those dust particles fall into your farm, and that could be a contributing source of cadmium too. So these are the human sources of cadmium that could be contributing to high soil cadmium levels. Once the cadmium is in the topsoil, the plant is going to take it. It's going to travel up the trunk of the tree, and it's going to accumulate mostly in the bark and in the wood of the tree. So it's going to accumulate in the branches. That's where the tree is storing most of its cadmium. Then the cadmium is going to move from the bark, from the wood. It's going to move mostly to the leaves, but it's also going to move to the pod. The pod is where the beans are. So this is the part that we're most concerned about. What happens next is that you have all these leaves that are high in cadmium. They're falling to the ground, and you're creating this very thick litter layer. And the litter layer is made up of fallen leaves and pods that were harvested. So you take the leaves that are already kind of high-ish in cadmium, they're falling onto the ground, and now they're forming a thick litter layer like the ones we see here, right? So this is a very common image of any cacao farm, at least in Colombia and Peru. Very thick litter layers made mostly of fallen dead leaves. This is another example. Now, add the guano and the phosphate fertilizers as one of the biggest sources of cadmium, and you're adding a bunch of cadmium to the topsoil. Now, put all of this together, you have a plant that's taking a lot of cadmium from additional input from fertilizers and pesticides. You have the fallen leaves that are creating a litter layer that's being enriched with cadmium. And this happens every time the tree is releasing leaves, right? So it becomes kind of like a cycle here in which the tree takes up the cadmium, it transfers it to the leaves and pods, they fall to the ground, you're adding fertilizers and pesticides, and the tree is taking up again some more cadmium. And every time this happens, it enriches the cadmium just a little bit more. But as trees get older, this can happen multiple times. So we found that old plantations, old farms, older trees tend to have the highest amount of cadmium just because of this kind of cycling mechanism, and just the addition of fertilizers over time enriches the topsoil with cadmium.
Daniel also spoke about some of the factors that increase cadmium levels. Here, particular reference is made to studies done in Peru.
And what we found here is that the Piura region of Peru has some farms that are high in cadmium. Given that the bean cadmium for the farms that we sampled was high enough to not pass EU regulation, the chocolate produced from the beans from these farms would have to be diluted with farms that have lower concentration of cadmium in their beans. So this would take an additional planning, another step of planning in order for this cacao to be put into the market. We found that even though soil cadmium is relatively low, the plant cadmium is high. So not just because you have low soil cadmium doesn't mean that your plant cadmium is going to be low. And what you're trying to sell here is beans. You're not trying to sell soil. So yeah, even though you have low soil cadmium, we found out that the plant cadmium could be 4, 5, 6 times higher than the soil cadmium. We found, same as in Colombia, farms at lower elevations on river soils tend to have higher cadmium than farms on steep terrain. We found that guano, which is made from bird feces in islands off the coast of Peru, and that phosphate fertilizers are a pretty big source of cadmium. We sampled fertilizers, guano, and organic compost samples to see if they could be identified as a source of cadmium, and they turn out to have high levels of cadmium. So we identified these as likely the biggest source of additional cadmium in the system. And even though we do have some sources of natural cadmium coming from rocks, we identified this to be minimal compared to the additions from phosphate fertilizers or guano.
Ladies and gentlemen, that was a synopsis of the presentations from the first webinar in our Cadmium Talk series. Our second webinar will explore exactly how cadmium gets into the plant. This work is made possible through project grant funding and support provided by the STDF and the 11th EDF of the European Union. On behalf of the entire Cadmium Talks team, I'm Althea Mackenzie.